Now that the whole model is done, let's add some good stylized materials and an outline to him. Even if you're finding this video outside of the character modeling series, it's still about a general stylized material that you can use for anything. Let's get into it. Since we don't need them anymore, turn off the reference collection or just hide them all. Let's go into rendered view. There aren't any lights, so we'll add some. But like I mentioned at the beginning of the series, I have a file you can download with some nice cosmetic background stuff and some lights if you want it. It's on my Gumroad. For the tutorial though, I'll add a single area lamp shining from around here. I'll make its power around 400. If we scale it down, it'll make our shadows a bit sharper, so I'll do that. Normally the most common lighting setup is called a 3-point lighting setup, which has 3 different lights for different purposes. But the stylized material we're making should only use 1 light, since it's very simple. We also don't want the world to be pitch black. So in the properties panel, you can go to this little globe tab to add a world color, which should be dark gray. Although I only don't have one because I deleted my previous world shader from my starter file, so you might already be good. I also forgot to change it when I started recording, so it'll be black for a bit. I want to get one thing out of the way right at the start. There's a weird setting in Blender that it might be making all of your colors a bit more dull. In the top tab, which is the render settings, at the very bottom, go to color management. Switch this option from AGX to standard. That'll solve the dull color problem. I don't really know much about this setting. All I know is that AGX is like some sort of film standard thing, so I guess it's easier for professionals to adjust colors in the way they know. But it's kind of annoying that it's on by default, since beginners don't care about that and wouldn't know how to change it, so just switch it to standard. I also like switching the look to medium-high contrast, since I'm always going for a sort of stylized look. You can change that however you want though. I'll also quickly mention Blender's different rendering engines, since you might be curious. The different rendering engines can change how you set up the scene and materials a lot, so I need to make sure we're using the same one. The main ones to care about are just Cycles and Eevee. I'm not going to go over all of their pros and cons. I'm just going to say that Cycles is more ideal for realism, and Eevee is more ideal for stylization. Both can be used for both purposes to an extent, but yeah, for now, just switch to Eevee if you ever changed it. And since you're definitely wondering it, apparently Eevee stands for Extra Easy Virtual Environment Engine. It's not named after the Pokemon, or at least you can't prove it in a court of law. We already have a black material for some of the face bits, so let's quickly turn that one's real color to black, and make its roughness 1. Now let's add a white material to the body, and apply that to anything that isn't black, which you do by pressing the sphere next to the material name and selecting whatever material you want. If they all have the same material, every change you make will apply to every different part, so it'll be a lot quicker. If you don't feel like dealing with materials too much, here's a quick and easy way to make a simple stylized material. Just in the normal principled shader settings right here, if you go to the emissions section, turn up the strength to somewhere between 0.2 and 0.5, depending on what you want. Emission means it'll glow, so we just added a slight glow to the character. This will brighten up the shadows a bit, and make the light parts feel more flat and colorful, which is a quick way of making a character feel more stylized. If you want a color other than white though, just make sure you change both the base color at the top and the emission color. The shader does work with the 3-point lighting I mentioned at the start, so I'd recommend looking that up if you want to use it. If you want something even simpler, you could even set the base color to black and then set the emission strength to 1. This makes the whole body just the emission color, with no shadows, which is as stylized as it gets. But to do anything more than that, we'll have to go into the shader editor. This is where 99.99% of all material editing is done. This also means that we'll need a new panel, so the thing I like doing the most is to hover over the bottom right corner of the viewport panel until your mouse turns into a plus, and click and drag into the middle of the viewport. That'll split this panel in 2. And now we can change what this panel is supposed to be. In the bottom or top left corner, this dropdown will show us all the different types of panels we can choose from. Obviously pick the shader editor. Now we can see what the materials are actually made of. This general method of working with things is called nodes. So many different parts of Blender use nodes, so it's super important to learn how they work. Basically, you add nodes to the string to add or alter data that eventually makes up the visible result of the model. As you can see at the end there is the material output, so whatever we want to show up should get plugged into there. By default, you start with a principled shader node, which is just a massive hodgepodge of useful settings to get a quick material started. These details show up in the properties panel since it was already plugged in. You should already know what the main parts of this node are if you watch my vase tutorial, but just in case you skipped it, I'll at least tell you that roughness is shininess, with 0 being shiny and 1 being flat. We're making a character here, so you generally want that to be pretty flat, unless your character is made of something shiny. Also, if you turned up the emission like I said before, make sure to turn it back down to 0 here. You don't need it. The settings in the properties panel are the exact same that you see in this node, so you just change it back here. But between this node and the output, you can add tons of different other nodes to do different things. If we press Shift A, which is always a shortcut for adding things in the program, you can see all the nodes we could be adding. Although much like the modifiers menu, I don't really go digging through all these dropdowns much. I'll tell you what to look for, so just go to the search bar. The simplest truly stylized material only takes 2 nodes. The first is the shader to RGB node. If you add it in, you can see that it's just a little thing. If you drag it on top of the line between the 2 other nodes and drop it, you can see it connects it right between them, so we should be seeing an effect. But nothing's happening, since all this node does is convert data to a different type. These colored dots on the nodes tell you what kinds of data they take and what kinds they put out. So obviously, the shader to RGB node takes the shader data from our principled shader and converts it to color data, as RGB stands for red, green, blue. Why would we want to do that? Well, this kind of data is way easier to mess with. Shader data is truly complex, but color data is just, color. So what we need to alter those colors is the most used single node in the program, the color ramp. I don't actually know if it's the most used, but it's the one I use the most. If we drop this on top of the line coming out of the shader to RGB node, we can now use these pins here to pull the colors on either side closer together, reducing the gradient between them, then making the color differences on the model sharper too, creating a nearly flat shadow, sometimes called cell shading. And the best part, we can actually select either of these pins and change their color at the bottom here, meaning we can choose exactly what we want both the base color and the shadow color to be, without having to care about any lighting shenanigans. All this cares about is the light shining on the model, where the brightest parts will get the colors on the right, and the darkest parts will get the colors on the left, with us being able to choose how they transition between each other in the middle. So if we move both of these pins off to the left, you can see the whole model get more overtaken by the light side, and vice versa. I'll make the base color white and the shadows slightly blue, since the white materials tend to look better with bluish shadows. Just having black or gray shadows tends to get boring. There are even more things you can do with the color ramp too. For one, you can add more pins, which means more colors along the gradient. You can press the plus here to add one, or just control click on the gradient to add one there. If we put one between here and give it a color, we can see it adds a little touch of color in the middle of the shadow. Not like we really need that, I just wanted to let you know it's a thing. Another important thing is up at the top here. This bit determines how smooth the gradient is between each pin. It says linear right now, so the gradient between each pin will be very straightforward and boring. But if we select it and switch it to B-spline, you can see it makes the gradient extend beyond the pin and make it extra smooth. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, if we change it to constant, it'll completely erase the gradient and make it instantly switch between the colors. That's probably more what you're thinking about when you think of stylized materials. Although as you can see, it does reveal that our model isn't exactly optimally smooth enough to make it look as perfectly anime as we might want it to look. The unfortunate news is that making a perfect stylized material takes a lot of effort, and even I haven't truly mastered it yet. I'll keep mine at a somewhat smooth shaded look, since I think that works better with my model specifically. Although I use a more advanced setup that I won't teach you right now. And just so you know, the shader to RGB node only works in EV, not cycles. We can add some extra bits to this material for some extra flair. First, let's add a Fresnel node. The S is silent. We can't actually just drop this one onto the line, unfortunately. We need to add it in a different way. If we click and drag off of this node's circle, we can see it's creating a line, so we can drag it to the input of something else to connect it. Let's add it to the output, so we can just see what it's doing without all the other nodes. It's adding a sort of edge glow effect. That could look really good if we flip the black and white instead. Its output is technically a factor output, which is basically just a value of 0 to 1 spread over the model, which manifests in the 3D view as black for 0 and white for 1. And hey, you know where else we saw a factor input? The color ramp. So let's add another one for this node and drop it on top of its line. Color ramps technically just apply color to values from 0 to 1, from 0 on the left to 1 on the right. Although like I said, it can also turn black and white to 0s and 1s to apply its gradient to them. So for this, if we want to make the edge glow sharper, we can bring the left pin inward so you can see the body is fully black. We can edit this later, but now that you've seen what it does, let's try and mix it in with the rest of the material. Keep the color ramp in black and white, for reasons I'll explain later. Pull out from an input socket to disconnect a line. There are 2 ways of doing this, where both technically work in this situation, but one's a bit better in this scenario, so I'll show you that one. Since we have the color data coming through here, we can add a node specifically made for mixing two color inputs together, which is called the mixed color node. It has both an A and a B slot that both accept color inputs. So let's plug each color ramp into each slot and plug it into the output. And he's gray now. That's because this mix setting isn't as useful here. It only shows us a direct in-between between the two pieces of color data we put in here. It evens out the white of the body with the black we saw from the Fresnel node, but we can change that to something else. All these different things in here are just like layer modes or styles like you see in art programs, if you already know those. If we just want to add the white part of the Fresnel node on top of the material we already had, let's switch it to add. It's still gray because the factor of this node is not full. In this case, the factor is like the percent intensity of the effect, so it's only at half intensity. We want it to be full in this case. That works. Now you can see an edge glow where the shadow is. Now we can go back to the color ramp and mess with the gradient again. To explain this, remember that black is represented by a 0 and white is represented by a 1. So we can think of the add expression just like it's math. If you try and add a 0 to a 1, it doesn't do anything, so you don't see any effect where there was black in the Fresnel node. But if you add a 1 to anything less than a 1, it'll bring it up to a 1, since 1 is the maximum in this case. So wherever there was darkness, which could be like a 0.5 on this scale, it'll add the white edge on top of it. But don't worry if you don't get the math as much. I'm trying to describe these things more in depth than just saying do this and do that. You can just copy the nodes and learn the inner workings later. You can also use this by not using the Fresnel as a color in itself, but as its value of 0 to 1. If we take it out of the color slot and plug it into the factor instead, then it'll be saying that a 0 or black will turn into whatever's in the A slot, and 1 or white will turn into whatever's in the B slot. If we mess with the Fresnel ramp a bit, you can see it's actually telling the mixed color node to show the original material on the edges, with the new base being whatever color's in the A slot. But of course, it'll be more useful if we swap the slots around, which means the bottom slot will be the color of the edge glow. Although since it's still on add, it'll only show up if the color we pick is relatively bright. So let's turn it back to mix. Mix is really only useful if you plug something like this into the factor. Now it'll be the exact color we choose, since there's no later style funny business going on. It's just saying, put this color where the Fresnel is white. This means we can make the color darker than the body, and it'll show up. For basic skin materials like this, I usually prefer going darker than lighter, but it can be whatever you want. Doing it like this is kind of a decent substitute for an outline if you don't want a full outline, but I'll be going into outlines in a bit. We still have some more material to deal with. I want to show you how to do this the second way really quick, since I sometimes want to add a Fresnel to models that use shader data, and shader data doesn't plug into these color slots. You need the shader to RGB node to do that. So we'll have to do this with the mix shader node instead. As you can see, it looks similar, but with less stuff to mess with. This one basically requires something to plug into the factor if you want it to look good. It's like it's permanently set to mix. So if we just plug the color ramp into the factor, that's all we need to do. But since we can't just select the color for the B slot, you actually have to add in another shader node. I'll just add in an emission node. That puts out a completely flat color, so it's easier than using the principled shader again. Also, since you can technically plug the color data into a shader slot, this method does also work for the color data, but since you have less control, you might as well just use the mixed color node then. Mixed color is for color data, and mixed shader is for shader data. It's much easier to remember. Either way, that's all done, but guess what? We can add even more. This time, let's add an ambient occlusion node, and plug it into the output to see what it does. Ambient occlusion is basically when it adds this kind of shadow to two parts of a model that are getting close to each other, which I think is usually a great thing to have, since it helps add some extra variation to the colors and shadows of a model. Just like before, we can add a color ramp and bring up this pin to make it darker. Then we can do the exact same thing with the mixed color node like before. Plug in the AO node's color ramp into the factor, with the previous material into one of the inputs, and then change the color to what we want the new shadows to be. Although if you remember, the AO node showed us that the base is actually white, while the shadows are black, which is the opposite of the Fresnel node. So we actually need to place the base in the B slot. Like I said before, black will turn into the A slot, and white will turn into the B slot. So in this case, the original nodes should be in the B slot, since the base part of the model when looking at the AO node was white. Now we can choose the color of the AO shadows. And that's all we're going to do for this material. There's still tons more you could do, but I think this much is the perfect amount for getting both a good result and giving you a good lesson in how nodes work. If my explanations on how these nodes work went over your head, don't worry about it. You can do the classic tutorial thing of just copying what the teacher did. Here's my setup. You'll learn how nodes work more and more as you use them more and more. The last thing I'll say is that you can add frames to groups of nodes to help sort them. It's just an add, layout, frame, and then you can shift select multiple nodes and drag them into this box, and it'll put the frame around them. You can also name these frames by right-clicking, selecting rename, and typing what this section is used for. I'm doing this since each section was a pretty clear addition to the base material. So we'll make 3 frames, call the first one base, the second Fresnel, and the last one AO, or Ambient Occlusion, and then put the relevant nodes in each. When making complex materials, your future self will thank you for sorting this stuff out. But I also did this to show you that if you wanted to make a lighter color Fresnel, you'll actually need to reorganize these and make the AO apply first, and then the Fresnel after. Otherwise, the AO shadows will apply on top of the Fresnel edge, since it's added to the node tree after the Fresnel was added. Just switch them around, but remember which slot the base color went into, so you can then just put it back in where it should be. Now the Fresnel will apply on top of the AO. I also want to show you how to apply multiple materials to a single object really quick. First, you need both materials in the material list of the object. You can add a slot, and instead of making a new one, you can press this sphere on the left to seal the materials that are already in the file. So we can just add the black material to the body. It doesn't look any different now, but if we go into edit mode, you can see we get some new buttons. Basically, we can apply this new material to any faces we select. So if we alt select some loops around the arm, then we go over to the materials tab, and with the black material selected, we can hit apply. Now the faces we selected are black. This is a good way of getting materials quickly into place, but since this way can only make it so faces are completely one material or another, you'll probably need to deal with textures to create a more complex pattern of colors on the body. Sometimes you just want the faces themselves to be different colors though. For example, the inside of the mouth. We can select the whole inside of the mouth and make the edge of this color somewhere on the back of the lips, and then apply the black. Since our character is so stylized, you probably just want to make the inside of the mouth black, so there will be a good contrast between it and the teeth and tongue. I also almost forgot to add the white to the teeth, and that we need to make a separate material for the tongue. We can copy a material by adding it to the model like normal, and then clicking this number icon next to its name to copy it. Then we can edit the copy to have different colors. Let's go for a reddish pink. It's hard to see, so open your guy's mouth with proportional editing and move it out to see what it looks like normally. Don't forget to undo all that though when you're done. Also, our black material is a little gray in some areas, so you can add all those extra nodes to it to mess with it more, but you can also just turn up the metallic to make it darker. I don't need it to be much more than pitch black, so this works for me. You can always copy the white material like I did for the tongue and make them any color you want. As I mentioned at the start, this material doesn't really get a good use out of the 3-point lighting setup, since it just increases the light being red by the shader to RGB and color ramp setup, which doesn't look all that great. Also, if you want to use colored lights for a scene, it also doesn't respond to that, since it overrides any color data with its own new colors. And even on top of that, you can't use roughness as easily, so it's harder to make a shiny object. But while in the making of this video, I found this video by the Sickly Wizard that shows a way to solve all of that, while still keeping things pretty simple. Honestly, if I saw it like a month ago, I probably would have rewritten this whole video around it. It's a short one, but if you don't feel like watching it, here's how I set it up with the character model. The main downside of this one is that it's harder to just choose the exact colors you want the base and shadow to be, but of course you can still do that, it just takes more nodes. That's it for materials, but since I know so many people are dying to put an outline on their model, here's the easiest way of doing that. First, we need to make a material for the outline, and add it to the material list of whatever you want to put the outline on. So for me, it'll be the body and hair. You won't really see an outline on the eyes or eyebrows, so don't bother adding it to them. Then, we don't even really need to go into the shader editor with this. We can actually switch to the output shader node right here. We just want the outline to be a flat black, so let's change it from principled to emission. And then change the color to black. The strength doesn't matter since it'll all just be black no matter what, but if you want the outline to be some other color, you'll just want to leave it at 1. We do actually need to change some more settings here, but let's go to the next step so we can actually see what the settings do. We actually use a modifier for the outline, but there isn't actually an outline modifier. What we actually need is a solidify modifier. It's kind of hard to explain, but since the solidify modifier adds a layer of faces to the outside, we can actually make it so we can look through the top layer of new faces and only see the inside of them, which ends up looking like an outline. First, change the offset to 1, so the outline will be extending out of the body and not going into it. Then, in the normal section, select flip. Then in the material section, make the offset like 8 or something, so it'll always use the material at the bottom of the list. That changes what material the new layer of faces is using, so now it's using the outline material we made. Everything here should be set up, so go back to the material settings. Down under the actual settings dropdown, just check this camera and shadow option, and boom, there's an outline. This is called backface culling. This is when a program completely ignores the inside faces of the model and turns them invisible, which tends to save processing power. But here, we actually flip the inside and outside of the new faces, meaning what is on the inside in space is actually technically the outside of the face as the program sees it. So turning on backface culling makes the outer crust invisible, so we can look through it and only see the visible inner crust. If that doesn't make any sense, just remember that's what you do to get this kind of outline. The technical term for this method is the inverted hole method, since you make a hole around the model and then invert it. Just to make things clearer down the line, I'll also rename this modifier to outline, so I know that's what it's there for. Now just mess with the thickness slider in the solidify modifier to change the thickness of the outline. But you'll quickly notice that this outline isn't perfect, especially when it comes to places like the hands. Just because this isn't a real outline and is instead just some faces extending off the body, certain areas don't really look how you'd want them to look, especially at higher thicknesses. There isn't a perfect fix to this. As far as I know, there isn't a truly perfect method of making outlines for 3D models, but since it's a thing that people will totally die for, I'm sure people are working on it. If you're looking to grease pencil though, that's a way you can manually draw lines onto your model, if that's something you're interested in. I can at least give you one method for patching some of those imperfections though. In the solidify dropdowns, there's this thickness clamp, which I think shrinks in areas that are thinner, except I'm not totally sure. If you turn it up, you see what it does. Some parts pinch inward. I like using this since it adds some easy variation to the outline. But really the main solution to getting a good outline is to just keep the thickness low. You only really need a super tiny bit to really get the effect across. And the ones on my actual characters are as tiny as it could be, since I think having that little bit makes things noticeably better, especially when it comes to stylized characters whose body material can often just blend into each other in different parts. Now that you've messed with the settings, you can copy this exact modifier to the hair so everything is consistent. Select the hair first, then the body, and then under the modifier's arrow drop down, click copy to selected. Since the hair already has the outline material in it, it'll work instantly, but if not, make sure you have the outline material last in its list. Now it's all consistent. Now here's a problem that's going to arise because of the outline. If you go back into solid view, our whole guy is covered in black. This is just because the solidify modifier is showing our outline's viewport shading color on top of everything. The solid view doesn't use backface culling by default, but we can turn it on. To the right of the viewport rendering spheres, you can click this arrow to bring up some toggles for this view. And yep, there's backface culling. Turn it on, and now we can see the outline like normal in this view too. But since backface culling makes the inside faces of a model invisible, it revealed that our irises are actually facing the wrong way. This is easy to fix though. It might be hard to select since you can't select the inside face with backface culling on, so you need to select it in the outliner. Then just go into edit mode, A to select everything, and Shift N or Alt N to recalculate them. If that doesn't work, just press flip. Back in the solid view menu, these other settings can be nice too, if you want to customize how this view looks. That's it for actually building out your first character. In the next video, we'll get to rigging him, and then after that, doing some extra junk like modeling clothes and adding textures. Those both can be done either on a rigged or unrigged model, so if you want to skip to that part, you can. See you later.